The morning of December 6, 1941, found Lieutenant Zengi Abe standing on the icy deck of the Akagi, his aircraft carrier cutting through frigid waters near Hitokapu Bay in the Coral Islands. His breath crystallized in the Arctic cold, forming delicate clouds that dissolved into the gray sky. Inside his leather flying jacket, pressed directly against his chest, lay two things of profound importance: a final letter to his wife and a lock of his own hair, prepared for his funeral should he not return. He had composed those farewell words that very morning: "If I do not return, know that I served with honor." But beneath those carefully chosen phrases, unspoken and troubling, a question gnawed at him. What of the Americans they were about to face? Were they truly the weakened adversary his commanders insisted they were? Within a single day, that question would find its answer in a manner more devastating than anyone could have anticipated. The discovery made by Japanese pilots over Pearl Harbor would not be tallied in numbers of sunken battleships or destroyed aircraft alone. Something far more terrifying awaited them. A revelation that would reshape the entire course of the war. They had not crippled a fading power sliding into irrelevance. They had instead struck at an industrial giant, one that possessed the capacity to bury them beneath waves of steel, endless streams of aircraft, and warships produced at rates that defied rational calculation. This is how Pearl Harbor appeared through Japanese eyes, not as a triumph of military might, but as the opening moment of a nation's gradual, horrifying awakening to the reality of what they had challenged. The road to that December morning had been paved with desperation rather than confidence. In July 1941, President Franklin Roosevelt took decisive action, freezing all Japanese assets held in America and imposing a sweeping embargo on oil exports. The British government and the Dutch East Indies Administration followed suit immediately. With these three measures, Japan lost access to 80% of the petroleum its empire depended upon. The carefully accumulated reserves, built up painstakingly over years, would sustain the nation for perhaps 18 months. Should war erupt, that window of opportunity would shrink to something less than a year. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commanding the combined fleet, grasped what many of his fellow officers refused to acknowledge or accept. His perspective came from lived experience. He had studied at Harvard University from 1919 to 1921, later served as naval attaché in Washington, and had personally walked American streets while observing American factories and witnessing firsthand the abundance that surrounded him. In January 1941, he composed a letter that articulated his deepest concerns about waging war against such an adversary. Should hostilities commence between Japan and the United States, he wrote, it would not prove sufficient to seize Guam and the Philippines, nor even Hawaii and San Francisco. To achieve genuine victory, we would have to march into Washington itself and dictate peace from within the White House. He questioned whether Japan's political leaders possessed the confidence necessary to ensure final victory, and whether they had genuinely prepared themselves for the sacrifices such a conflict would demand. Yamamoto recognized that such an outcome was impossible, yet he remained a patriot. When his nation chose the path of war, he would be the one to architect the attack. His strategic vision possessed a brutal clarity. The American Pacific Fleet would be struck at Pearl Harbor with overwhelming force. The battleships would be sunk, the grounded aircraft destroyed. This would buy Japan precious time, perhaps 6 months, possibly a year, to seize the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies, acquire the rubber of Malaya, and gather the resources essential for survival. Then, negotiating from a position of apparent strength, Japan could achieve peace before American industrial capacity mobilized fully. It was a gambler's strategy conceived by a man whose nature inclined toward gambling, and like most gamblers, he would ultimately lose. The First Air Fleet departed Hitokapu on November 26, 1941, a formidable armada moving north across waters that few ventured into during winter months. 6 aircraft carriers sailed in formation: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku. 2 battleships accompanied them, along with 3 cruisers, 9 destroyers, 7 fuel tankers, and 3 submarines. The flight decks of those carriers carried 414 aircraft, everyone piloted by naval aviators trained to exceptional standards. Throughout the entire 3,500-mile journey across the North Pacific, the fleet maintained absolute radio silence. The commanders had deliberately chosen the northern route, deliberately selecting waters that winter storms and extreme cold rendered inhospitable. American reconnaissance aircraft, they reasoned, would not be searching these freezing seas for enemy activity. The fleet reached its launch position at 0600 hours on December 7, 1941, stationed 230 miles north of Oahu. Commander Mitsuo Fujita prepared to lead the first wave of 183 aircraft. As dawn light began spreading across the Pacific, his pilots lifted off from the Akagi's flight deck one after another, climbing into the gray morning sky. The pilots had spent months preparing for this moment, training repeatedly over Kagoshima Bay, a location that had been deliberately selected because its geography mirrored Pearl Harbor's layout with striking accuracy. Mountains descended to shallow water, requiring approaches at extremely low altitudes, demanding tremendous precision. The torpedo bombers had practiced their weapons drops countless times, releasing their payloads at altitudes of merely 10 to 20 meters above the water surface. The torpedoes themselves had been specially designed to run at depths of 10 meters below the surface, preventing them from striking the shallow harbor bottom as standard-issue torpedoes would. Among those pilots flew Kaname Harata, assigned to the carrier Soryu. In September, as training operations intensified dramatically, he had sent his pregnant wife back to her family home in Nagano, following tradition. Their parting had been expressed with the emotional restraint demanded by Japanese custom. Neither had allowed their true feelings to show openly. Yet she had written to him daily until the fleet sailed away into silence. At 0740 hours, Fujita's formation spotted Pearl Harbor spreading beneath them, the harbor crowded with targets. 8 battleships were moored in neat rows along Battleship Row. The American fleet sat at anchor exactly as naval intelligence had predicted. But Fujita's trained eyes detected something deeply wrong, something crucial to their plans. The 3 American aircraft carriers, Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, were nowhere to be seen. They were at sea, their exact positions unknown to Japanese command. Fujita made his decision instantly. The attack would proceed as planned. He slid open his canopy and fired a single dark blue flare into the morning light, the signal his pilots had trained for months to recognize instantly. Then he transmitted 3 words that would echo throughout history. Tora, Tora, Tora. Tiger, 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 confirming complete surprise had been achieved. The assault unfolded across 2 waves spanning 1 hour and 15 minutes. When the smoke finally cleared, 2,403 Americans lay dead, and 1,178 more had sustained wounds. The battleship Arizona became a burning coffin, sinking permanently, a total loss that could never be restored to service. The Oklahoma joined it in complete destruction. 4 additional battleships, West Virginia, California, Nevada, and Tennessee, suffered severe damage but would eventually be salvaged and returned to operation. Ground crews counted 188 aircraft destroyed where they sat on the airfield. By contrast, the Japanese paid a relatively modest price. 29 aircraft did not return, 5 midget submarines were lost, and 64 men perished. Measured by conventional military standards, the attack represented an extraordinary achievement. Yet as Japanese pilots circled above the burning harbor, preparing their return to the carriers, several among them observed troubling details that would haunt them in the years ahead. The massive fuel storage tanks lining the shoreline, containing millions upon millions of gallons of petroleum, remained completely untouched. The submarine base stood intact and functional. The repair facilities had escaped damage. The dry docks remained operational and ready for use, and those 3 missing carriers continued to prowl somewhere out in the Pacific, undamaged and waiting. Lieutenant Zengi Abe flew in the second wave, piloting a Val dive bomber. By the time his formation reached Pearl Harbor, the Arizona was already transformed into a blazing wreck. A bomb from the first wave had struck her forward magazine, triggering a catastrophic detonation that claimed 1,177 lives in a single terrible moment. Abe directed his bombs toward ships that still possessed fighting capability, adding his contribution to the destruction already spreading across the harbor. The question that had nagged at him on Akagi's frozen deck found no resolution in the flames and chaos below. Only new uncertainties multiplied. Back aboard the Akagi, Commander Fujita urged Vice Admiral Nagumo to authorize a third wave, to return and finish the job by destroying the fuel tanks and repair infrastructure. Nagumo refused. The fleet had accomplished its primary objective. The element of surprise had been squandered. American forces were now fully mobilized and alert. The carriers must withdraw immediately before American naval aviation could locate and engage them. His decision was tactically reasonable but strategically ruinous. The vessels Japan had damaged would be raised from the harbor floor. Aircraft would be manufactured to replace those destroyed. Yet this choice to leave the shore infrastructure standing intact would prove catastrophic. Pearl Harbor would remain operational as the forward base for the entire Pacific Fleet throughout the remainder of the war. As the Japanese fleet steamed back across the Pacific toward home waters, pilots began grappling with the implications of what they had witnessed. Yes, battleships had been sunk. Yes, surprise had been achieved completely. Yet the American base they had attacked revealed something profoundly unsettling about the adversary they faced. The scope of Pearl Harbor's facilities, the sheer quantity of ships present, the visible infrastructure even from attack altitude, all of it suggested industrial capacity far exceeding what Japanese intelligence had reported. If this represented merely a single American base, how many others must exist across the vast Pacific? How many shipyards fed this system? How many factories produced the materials visible before their eyes? The mathematical answer would arrive with brutal precision in the months that followed. In 1941, Japan's aircraft factories produced 5,088 planes. The United States, during that same year, produced 19,433, nearly 4 times the Japanese total. The disparity would only widen as time progressed. During 1942, as Japan struggled desperately to replace the 4 carriers lost at Midway in June, American shipyards launched the USS Essex, the first of a carrier class that would eventually comprise 24 vessels. Japan had entered the war with 10 carriers operating throughout its fleet. Following the Midway disaster, the nation would never again operate more than 6 simultaneously. The numbers grew increasingly catastrophic with each passing year. By 1943, American factories achieved production rates of approximately 8,000 to 9,000 aircraft monthly. Japan's entire production for the complete calendar year reached only 16,000 planes. The United States manufactured more aircraft in 2 months than Japan managed in 12. Consider the Liberty ship program. The SS Robert E. Lee was constructed in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes from keel laying to launch. The keel was laid just past midnight on November 8, 1942, and the completed ship launched on November 12. While this particular effort served as a publicity demonstration and normal production averaged 42 to 50 days per vessel, by 1943, American shipyards were launching 3 Liberty ships every 2 days. In merely the first 4 months of 1943, American yards produced more merchant tonnage than Japan had built across its entire 7 years of war preparation. The aircraft production gap proved equally devastating. In 1944 alone, the United States produced 96,000 aircraft, a staggering figure that defies easy comprehension. The Willow Run plant in Michigan, operated by Ford Motor Company, produced B-24 Liberator bombers at a rate of 1 every 63 minutes, continuously, 24 hours per day. Each bomber required 1,450,000 individual parts assembled together, yet American workers assembled them faster than Japanese factories could produce fighters to defend against them. By late 1943, Japanese pilots began encountering a phenomenon for which their training had never prepared them. American forces operating with resources that appeared literally unlimited. In June 1944, the Battle of the Philippine Sea brought together Task Force 58, which assembled 15 American carriers and 900 aircraft. The Japanese forces opposing them, many now flown by hastily trained replacement pilots following the catastrophic losses at Midway and subsequent engagements, were slaughtered in what American pilots grimly called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japan lost between 350 and 600 aircraft, plus 2 additional carriers. The American industrial machine had now achieved a production pace that rendered Japanese resistance mathematically impossible to sustain. Pilots fortunate enough to survive witnessed this transformation, experienced psychological devastation as complete and thorough as any physical military defeat. Letters home from Japanese aviators grew increasingly desperate. Where do all these aircraft originate? We shoot them down, and the sky immediately fills with replacements. This is industrial annihilation, they wrote. By 1945, Japan's strategic position had become truly hopeless. The oil fields captured in the Dutch East Indies could not deliver their product to Japanese refineries. American submarines, produced at rates Japanese shipyards could never match, had effectively severed the supply lines. Oil tankers rested on the ocean floor by the hundreds. Japan's navy, once the third largest naval force in the world, had been reduced to harbor defense operations. The elite pilots trained at Kagoshima Bay, those who had achieved complete surprise at Pearl Harbor, were mostly dead now, replaced by boys possessing months of training rather than years. Some were sent on one-way missions, kamikaze attacks, a final admission that conventional naval aviation could no longer compete. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 were almost superfluous by that point. Japan's industrial capacity lay destroyed. Its cities burned from conventional bombing. Its navy had vanished. Its air force was reduced to suicide attacks. The empire that had struck at Pearl Harbor, believing 6 months of victories would force a negotiated peace, had instead triggered the total mobilization of an industrial power producing at rates beyond Japanese comprehension. America manufactured 297,000 aircraft during the war, 193,000 artillery pieces, 86,000 tanks, and 2 million army trucks. Japan's complete war production across every category represented less than 10% of American output in most cases, less than 5% in many. Admiral Yamamoto had been proven tragically and completely correct. After 6 months, he had written, "We will have utterly no confidence in ultimate victory." He would not live to witness the full scope of catastrophe his attack on Pearl Harbor had unleashed. On April 18, 1943, American fighters, guided by intercepted and decoded messages from the JN-25B cipher, revealing his inspection tour itinerary, ambushed his transport aircraft over Bougainville. Yet from the beginning, he had known. He had walked American streets. He had observed American factories. He understood American capacity. His final gamble rested on a belief that spirit and skill might overcome industrial superiority. He was tragically wrong. The Japanese pilots who survived the war, including Lieutenant Zengi Abe and others who had executed the Pearl Harbor attack, would spend decades processing what they had witnessed. The attack on Pearl Harbor was a brilliant tactical success that guaranteed strategic defeat. They had not struck at a weak or unprepared enemy. They had struck at a sleeping giant that, once awakened, possessed industrial power beyond anything they had ever imagined. The oil embargo that pushed Japan toward war had been intended to prevent Japanese expansion. Instead, it triggered a conflict that exposed the true hierarchy of global industrial capacity. Japan, which had modernized in merely 50 years and achieved regional power status, had challenged a nation possessing 17 times its gross national income, 5 times its steel production, and twice its population. Once American production fully mobilized, the outcome was never genuinely in doubt. American industrial might accomplish what Yamamoto had feared most, not through superior strategy or tactical brilliance alone, though both played their roles, but through something simpler and more relentless, overwhelming, continuous production. American factories built ships faster than they could be sunk. American industry produced aircraft faster than they could be shot down. American shipyards, aircraft plants, tank factories, and supply chains operated at a scale that rendered Japanese resistance increasingly futile with each passing month. By the time Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, the nation that had struck at Pearl Harbor in 1941 had been comprehensively defeated, not by American fighting spirit alone, though that mattered, but by American industrial capacity operating at percentages of global output that Japan could never match. The pilots who attacked Pearl Harbor had awakened a giant, and that giant had buried them in steel.